All right, so today we're going deep on a case that I think it's safe to say it's one of those that really gets under your skin.
Hmm.
Full of twists and turns, really unsettling stuff. We're looking at that triple murder in Chickasha, Oklahoma, back in February 2021. What starts off looking like a straightforward as a murder can be, quickly becomes something much more disturbing.
Yeah, you're not wrong there. There's something about this case that makes it stick out, even among other violent crimes. That detail about Lawrence Paul Anderson, the guy who did it, cooking and trying to serve one of his victims' hearts to his own family, it really makes you wonder what could push someone to do something so horrific.
Exactly. And honestly, we might never really know the why behind something this brutal, but I'm hoping that by going through all the material, the court documents, psych evaluations, interviews, we can at least get a grip on what led up to that day. Maybe even find some answers along the way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good goal. When we look at cases like this, it's not about, sensationalizing the violence, right? It's more about breaking down the factors involved, the systemic issues, the individual circumstances, all of that, trying to see the bigger picture.
For sure. And as we go through all this, I do want to say that, this is sensitive stuff. We're talking about real people, families whose lives were cut short in a terrible way.
Absolutely. It's really important to remember the human cost of this whole thing as we get into the
Okay,
details.
so let's start with Lawrence Paul Anderson himself. This wasn't his first run-in with the law, was it?
Oh, no, not by a long shot. Anderson had a pretty long rap sheet going all the way back to 2006. Drug possession, assault, even firearm charges. He was in and out of prison for years.
So a pattern of violence and crime was already there. Then in 2017, he gets sentenced to 20 years, a serious sentence, for drugs and firearms. But here's where it gets interesting. He's released early in January 2021 as part of this mass commutation effort in Oklahoma. Now, just so everyone's on the same page, commutation means reducing a prison sentence, right?
That's right. The idea was to ease some of the overcrowding in prisons and maybe give people a second chance. But with Anderson, the decision to commute his sentence, well, that became a big part of the whole story.
And that's because there was a lot of back and forth about how he even ended up on that list for commutation in the first place.
Exactly. At first, Anderson was actually denied commutation. But then, because of what they called a clerical error, his name ended up on the list anyway. From there, the parole board said okay to releasing him, and the governor signed off on it.
What gets me is this wasn't just some nonviolent offender getting a break. Anderson had a history of violence, yet the system didn't seem to pick up on that as a risk.
That's a really important point. This case makes you question how well those risk assessment tools that parole boards use actually work. Did they miss something? Were there warning signs? Or were the tools themselves just not good enough?
Big questions that I'm sure we'll be thinking about more as we go deeper. And we can't forget the victims' families. They filed a lawsuit saying state officials were negligent in letting Anderson out early. They say his past should have been a huge red flag.
That lawsuit adds a whole other layer to this. It gets into the legal consequences of these kinds of decisions and shows what can happen when the system doesn't protect people.
Before we get into that day itself, I think we need to talk about the victims. Can you tell us about them?
Of course. The first victim was Andrea Lynn Blankenship. She was 41 and lived next door to Anderson's aunt and uncle. Then there was Leon Pye, he was 67, and his granddaughter, Chaos Yates, just 4 years old. She was just visiting her grandparents when it all happened. Going through everything, what really stuck with me was Chaos's mom describing her as a diamond in a world of coal. Just shows you what a bright light was lost that day.
Awful. It reminds you that beyond the headlines, the legal stuff, there were real people with families, loved ones, all taken away.
Yeah, you're right. We have to remember that as we go through this.
So February 9th, 2021. What happened? The details are pretty rough.
Well, it started with Anderson breaking into Andrea Blankenship's place. He stabbed her, killed her, and then, and this is hard to even say, he cut out her heart.
God, it's so gruesome, it's almost impossible to imagine.
Then he took the heart to his aunt and uncle's house and cooked it with potatoes. Then he tried to make them eat it, saying it would release the demons.
Okay, that's where it goes from disturbing to just. I don't even know what could possibly be going through someone's mind.
I think that's something investigators and psychologists are still trying to figure out. It's like something out of a horror movie, but it actually happened.
And when his family refused to eat it, that's when things got even worse, right?
Tragically, yeah. He attacked his uncle, Leon, and little Chaos, stabbing them both. He also attacked his aunt, Dilsey, who thankfully survived, but with serious injuries.
It's just unthinkable, the brutality.
It was a bloodbath. The police got a 911 call, a hang-up, from the Pye's house. Later, they found out a voicemail was left on a phone during the attack. You can hear Ko screaming while she's being killed.
God, that just chills me to the bone. The terror she must have felt.
When the police got there, they found Anderson in a back bedroom. He was throwing up. They arrested him and took him to the hospital for his injuries. 2 days later, while he's still in the hospital, he confesses, admits to killing Blankenship, and says he tried to make his family eat her heart.
And that confession's what led police to Blankenship's house where they found her body, right?
Yes. Awful confirmation of what he said, adding to the tragedy.
At his first court appearance, they say Anderson was all over the place, sobbing, begging the judge not to give him bail.
Yeah. Makes you wonder what his state of mind was like then, and during the crimes, too. Was he really sorry? Was it an act? Or was there something more seriously wrong with him?
We'll definitely be looking into that, especially when we get to those psych evaluations.
Mhm.
And we can't forget that at first, they were considering the death penalty for Anderson.
But then, as part of a plea deal, they decided not to go for that. Anderson pleaded guilty to everything, which meant the families didn't have to go through a trial. He got life in prison without parole.
So legally, it's over.
Yeah.
But those questions about why he did it, his mental state, the mistakes that let him out early, those are still there.
Absolutely. This is where the real digging starts. Beyond the news and the court stuff, trying to understand what could lead someone down such a dark path.
And that's what we'll be doing in the next part of this deep dive. We'll look closer at the possible reasons behind all this, Anderson's psychological profile, and what this case means for the justice system as a whole.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, so stick with us. This is where it gets really interesting. So we were talking about those lingering questions, right? About Anderson's motives and how the system might have played a role in all this. One of the big things we got to unpack is that decision to let him out of prison early.
Right, and the goal of reducing overcrowding and giving people second chances, that's a good thing. But Anderson's case really shows you the risks involved in these programs, Makes you wonder if there are better ways to deal with overcrowding without putting people in danger. That's the tough question, isn't it? How do you find that balance between rehabilitation and keeping the public safe? It's tricky. And in Anderson's case, it was the governor who made the final call, approving what the parole board recommended. But like we said before, the grand jury found out that Anderson was only on that commutation list because of a mistake, a clerical error. So it's like a bunch of things going wrong at the same time. This policy to reduce the prison population, a big bureaucratic mess up, and then they don't even really assess how dangerous he might be. And it all leads to this horrible outcome. Really makes you think about the checks and balances or lack of them in the system.
Absolutely. This case caused a lot of controversy in Oklahoma. Lots of people blaming the governor and the parole board for letting Anderson out. The victims' families, they were devastated, felt like the system completely failed them, like justice wasn't served.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with them.
Yeah.
When you have a case this awful, so senseless, it makes you question who's responsible and whether we need to be way more careful about how we handle parole and these commutations.
You're right on the money. This case really exposes how hard it is to balance compassion and trying to rehabilitate people with the need to protect everyone else. Clearly, something went wrong at different levels, from the decision to let him out to just not keeping an eye on him properly.
It shows how complicated criminal justice reform is. We have to be willing to talk about the hard stuff. How do we balance compassion with safety? Are our policies working? Are they doing what they're supposed to? And are they keeping people safe?
I agree completely. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and get into one of the most disturbing parts of this whole thing. Anderson saying he cooked and tried to feed his victim's heart to his family. I mean, that's just bone-chilling. What does that tell us about his mental state? What was he thinking?
I'll be honest, that's the part that I can't get out of my head. It's so strange and awful, it's hard to even process. Is there any rational explanation? Or are we talking about something we just can't understand?
That's the problem with a case like this, right? We can try to look at it from different angles, psychology, sociology, maybe even cultural stuff. But in the end, we may never truly get the why behind something this messed up. Some people have said this could be connected to cannibalism, but we got to be careful about labeling him like that. We're talking about a complicated person whose actions might not fit into any neat category.
It's tempting to just call him a cannibal based on this one thing, but like you said, we got to look at the whole picture.
Exactly. Anderson had a history of drugs, maybe mental health problems, and violence. His actions were probably influenced by a whole bunch of factors: his mental state, the drugs, maybe even some cultural or religious beliefs we don't fully understand.
So yeah, it's super disturbing, but we have to be careful not to just sensationalize it. It's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
That's right. We need to look at all the evidence, his history, how he acted, what he said. That's how we can start to understand what might have pushed him to do these terrible things. And this is where those psychological evaluations become really important.
Right, because those could tell us something about his mental state at the time of the crimes. What did they find?
Well, the specific details of those evaluations haven't been made public. But we know that they were going to do a mental health evaluation to see if he was even fit to stand trial.
So even though we don't know the specifics, the fact that they thought an evaluation was necessary means they were worried about his mental state.
Exactly. And that brings up some important questions about how the justice system deals with mental health. Did Anderson have a mental illness? If he did, was he getting proper treatment before they let him out? We have to think about all this when we try to understand what led to this tragedy.
And it shows how much we need better mental health care, both in prisons and out in the community.
Absolutely. If someone's dealing with a mental health problem, they need help and support, not just punishment.
It seems like this case really shows how problems in the system, combined with what was going on with Anderson personally, led to these terrible consequences.
I couldn't agree more. As we go deeper, we need to think about what this case means for the criminal justice system as a whole.
Yeah.
How can we make those risk assessments that parole boards use more accurate? What can we do to make sure people who've been violent and might have mental health issues get the treatment and supervision they need? These are tough questions, but we gotta face them if we want to stop this from happening again.
It's a big challenge, but I think it's a conversation worth having. And I hope that by really examining this case, we can help people understand these complicated issues better.
I think that's a great goal. Now, let's talk about another important part of this case. The lawsuit the victims' families filed against Oklahoma officials. They say those officials were negligent in releasing Anderson early, that they should have seen his violent past as a warning sign.
That lawsuit brings up a whole other set of questions about who's responsible and what the system is supposed to do. What could happen because of this lawsuit? Could it change how things are done in the future? It's a big one, right? This lawsuit really gets to the core of what we've been talking about, trying to balance compassion with holding people accountable. If those families win, it could change how these early release programs work, how they're set up and run.
Absolutely. If they're successful, it could mean stricter rules about who qualifies for these commutations. They might look more closely at someone's criminal history, their mental health evaluations, maybe even use better risk assessment tools.
But it also makes you think about, like, what's the point of the justice system in the first place? Are we just about punishing people? Or is there a duty to help them get better, to reintegrate them into society? And how do we do that while also keeping everyone safe?
Man, that's a debate that's been going on forever. This case really brings those questions to the forefront. It's not easy finding that balance.
And this lawsuit, it shows the real human cost of these decisions. These families, they believe that if the system had worked right, their loved ones would still be alive.
Their pain, the way they're fighting for justice, it's powerful. It reminds us that behind all the legal stuff, the headlines, the numbers, there are real people whose lives have been shattered by violence and loss.
Makes you think. And it shows why what we're doing here, this deep dive, is so important. Is we're not just looking at a case, we're looking at a tragedy that has affected so many people way beyond the courtroom.
Exactly. And we can't forget about Delcy Pye, the woman who survived the attack. She's still dealing with the physical and emotional trauma from that night. Her life, just like the families of the victims, will never be the same.
It makes you think about the long-term effects of something like this, the trauma, not just on the people who were directly involved, but on their families and communities too.
Trauma can have an impact for generations. And in this case, it's even worse because they feel like the system let them down, that it didn't protect them.
Which brings us back to that lawsuit. It's not just about money. It's about making those in charge take responsibility for their decisions. It's about demanding that things change so this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, it's a powerful message. And no matter what happens with the lawsuit, it's already started a conversation we need to have about how to reform the justice system, how to provide mental health care, and how to find that balance between compassion and safety.
So even though the case against Anderson is closed, this story isn't over. There's still so many questions, and the fight for justice for those victims and their families, it goes on.
We may never fully understand what made Lawrence Paul Anderson do what he did, and the scars left on everyone involved, they may never truly heal.
Tough to think about, but true. As we wrap up this deep dive, I hope people listening are left with more than just the scary details of this case. I hope they feel a sense of, I don't know, responsibility maybe, A responsibility to talk about these tough issues, to question what we think we know, and to fight for a world where things are more just and compassionate.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This case, as awful as it is, maybe it can be something that leads to change. A reminder that we all have a part to play in making a world where tragedies like this aren't just something we mourn, but something we work to prevent.
And to everyone listening out there, I'll leave you with this. What can we do on our own and together to fix the problems in the system that we've been talking about? How can we build a future where everyone feels safe, supported, and where justice is real? Not just an idea, it's something to think about, a conversation to keep having. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive